people who live in what used to be legally segregated neighborhoods. They're not legally segregated now, they're more de facto segregated, and have poor schools as a result, because we're requiring that people only go to the schools that are in their local area, has a downstream effect on people. So that's why we support school choice. That's why we support universal education savings accounts. That's why we support reducing the cost of living, because non-white Americans are disproportionately low income relative to whites and Asians. If you actually make America more affordable for everybody, you happen to address some of these inequities from the past. So it's not like we're...
Hello, welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today, we're delighted to have someone on who's another freedom fighter, happy warrior, and overall good guy. And it's none other than Avik Roy. Avik, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Hey, Vance, thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. We got a lot to talk about. Today is November 13th, 2023. So in case something happens between now and when this airs, the audience will know when we recorded this. But we've got a lot to talk about. So before we get into it, let me first go over your bio for the audience, and then we'll jump right into it. Avik Roy is public policy, his fourth career, but clearly his favorite one. He was born to Indian immigrants in Rochester, Michigan, a place that instilled in him a lifelong fondness for the Michigan Wolverines and the Detroit Red Wings. He finished high school in San Antonio, Texas. After training as a scientist at MIT and as a physician at Yale Medical School, Avik moved to Boston to join a then unknown investment firm called Bain Capital, where he focused on identifying biotechnology companies, developing therapies for diseases that had heretofore gone untreated. 2016's political outcome convinced Avik that the same old wasn't working. He notes that both parties are failing to work for people who are struggling in the 21st century economy. That's why FREOPP, his new group, focuses exclusively on research that moves the needle for people with below median incomes or net worth. Really, it's not a new group. It's been around for a while, so we'll talk about that in a minute. And Avik has been a central figure in the debate over how to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Avik has also writes frequently on the rise of Bitcoin and decentralized finance, and he still lives in Austin with their two younger children. So, Avik, a lot of great stuff there going on. Let me start you off first with, why do you do what you do every day?
I think what it comes down to fundamentally is, I have young kids, as do you, and I want my kids to grow up in a solvent America. I want my kids to have a brighter future, just as, our parents grew up knowing that you and I could have a brighter future. And a lot of that's under threat. The reason it's under threat is because America is going insolvent. A byproduct of America going insolvent is that a lot of Americans are struggling. Ordinary Americans are struggling with the high cost of healthcare, the high cost of housing. And soon, because of the debt that we're piling up, inflation is going to be a persistent problem for all Americans, but particularly lower and middle income Americans, because if you're wealthy, you don't have to worry about it. You're going to be fine. You can survive through disruptions better than someone making $30,000-$40,000 a year living paycheck to paycheck, or dependent on the government for benefits, even worse. So lower middle income Americans and all of us are going to really struggle unless we can solve some of these big public policy challenges, like the entitlement crisis, like the rising cost of housing, like the debt. In order to do that, we need to come up with solutions that can get enough public support that they can pass the U.S. Senate, pass the House, be signed by the president of law. We need to be able to attract to the pro-freedom movement constituencies that historically have not been part of the pro-freedom movement. We have to show everyone in America that economic freedom and fiscal responsibility are things that benefit them and make their lives better. And the only way we're going to do that is by rallying everyone around something that all Americans, at least nearly all Americans, want, which is a country in which everyone has a fair shot at success, where all of us have the opportunity to get better by working hard and being responsible, working hard and playing by the rules, as a former president used to say. And so what we're trying to do at FREOPP, I'm giving you a long-winded answer, but what it comes down to is we're trying to expand the constituency for freedom by showing how freedom can benefit all Americans, and by doing everything we can to build public support for pro-freedom legislation.
Yeah. No, it's great, Avik. And for the audience, the FREOPP, we're shorthanding it, but it's the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. You can also find it at freopp.org. and I'll put a link to the show notes page. So it covers all of those things. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank improving the lives of Americans on the bottom half of the economic ladder using freedom, innovation, and pluralism. And those are, of course, some of the things that I talk a lot about here, Avik, on the Let People Prosper show. As you might suspect, being a free market economist and talking about these things and poverty relief initiatives. And I talked about kind of coming up where I did growing up in South Houston, Texas, pretty low income area, single mom. You never know what the future is going to hold. But there's a lot of people who are, like you said, really struggling right now in the situation that we're in. And it just seems like there's one thing after another that they just can't keep their head above water. And so I'm so glad that you're working on these issues and have been for so long. What are some of the areas that come first to your mind? You mentioned a few of them, but what are some of the other areas that you really think come first to mind that we really need to look at those trade-offs and potential solutions?
Well, the idea that led me to start FREOPP, there's a couple of different reasons. I mentioned some of the policy reasons, but there's some other elements to it too, and I'll use that as a way of answering your question. So
Yeah.
Arthur Brooks, who used to run the American Enterprise Institute, he used to give a stump speech that I heard a number of times because we would often speak at the same conferences, where he would say, look, there's this annual assembly of all the AEI scholars, and I would tell them every year, I want you to wake up every morning and go to bed every night thinking about what you did today to help the poor, because the nobility of individual and economic freedom is that free enterprise has lifted more people out of poverty than any other idea that humanity's ever invented. And I always thought that was really well said, but I think the challenge for an AEI, as great of an institution as AEI is, they're an 80-year-old institution, and you have people who've worked there for 30 years, and some of them may be nodding their heads as Arthur speaks and want to rally around that cause. But it's like, if you're trying to lose weight or diet or work out in the gym, it's hard to change your habits. Sometimes you have a certain way of doing things,
Yeah.
and it's hard to reorient yourself to wake up every morning and go to bed every night thinking about how you help the poor that day. You're just not used to it because that's not the way you've been doing your work from before, through no fault of your own. It's just there's lots of different ways to approach your work. And so my thought was, what if we built an organization where that was not merely an exhortation or a suggestion, but a requirement? We require that all of our scholars think every day about how their work will improve the lives of Americans whose incomes or wealth are below the US median. So that's a requirement. We literally don't pay our scholars unless their work centers around those arguments. The other piece of it is, having worked on 3 presidential campaigns for Mitt Romney in 12 and Rick Perry and Marco Rubio in 16, I saw firsthand how important think tank work is in presidential campaigns, in political campaigns in general. Candidates really depend on think tanks. You know this as well from your own work. They depend on people like us to generate ideas that are well vetted, that are thought through, that they can run on and campaign on and stick their necks out on, knowing that people who've really dug into an issue have thought hard about how to design a better policy in a way that's politically viable, that works economically, and that will make people better off. The other piece of it is, again, how do you expand the constituencies for freedom? So you put all that together, and what we do at FREOPP is, as I said, we require, for all the issues we work on, all the scholars we hire, everything we work on has to meet 2 tests. Test number 1 is your idea, your solution has to result in a net expansion of liberty. Now, that may mean more regulation here and less subsidies there, or less subsidies there and more regulation here. The point is the net amount of liberty has to increase, but it may involve restructuring where the government is involved in order to expand and maximize freedom. That's one element of it. And then the second element of it, as I said, can you improve outcomes for lower and middle income Americans? And so when you use that filter, those 2 filters for the policy issues you work on, you end up working on a lot of issues that relate to the cost of living. Because if you think about where economic freedom can help lower and middle income Americans, one major area is if you're making $40,000 a year. Yes, job growth and wage growth matter, but job growth and wage growth matter more if the cost of living is not increasing. The cost of living is increasing along with let's say your wages are growing 5%, but your cost of living is increasing 10%, then you're falling behind every year. You're not getting ahead. And so you hear a lot of talk on the left about income inequality. And one thing we talk about is disposable income inequality. So once you've taken cost of living out and once you've taken your taxes out, what's left over for you? And the fact is, in places like San Francisco, the cost of living is astronomical to the point where middle class people can't live there. And they think of themselves as the most progressive people in the world. And yet they have the most inequality
Hmm.
because the cost of living is so high. And so, if you think about where economic freedom relates to that, if you make energy less expensive, you make healthcare less expensive, if you make housing less expensive through pro freedom policies, that actually makes a meaningful difference for lower and middle income Americans. So 70% of our work result is around cost of living, and particularly the core drivers of consumer consumption. So that's
Hmm.
energy, housing, and healthcare and education. Those are the big
Hmm.
categories. Food is another big category of consumption for people, but it's one that's been relatively stable relative to the
Yeah.
others. So the other ones are the ones that are really increasing
Yeah.
relative to conventional inflation. So those are ones that we spend a lot of time on. And then the other couple of areas that are not so much directly about cost of living that we spend some time on are K through 12
Hmm.
education and criminal justice reform, because
Yeah.
it's obviously extremely important that people be able to walk the streets and be safe,
Hmm.
but it's also important that we do so with the lightest possible touch, so that we're not locking people out of the economy. If you put
Yeah.
innocent people or people who are guilty of pretty ticky tack offenses in prison for felonies, maybe they're only in prison for a year, but it's an economic life sentence because once you have a felony on your record, it's hard to get a real job.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot, and you know about this from your work at TPPF.
Hmm.
Obviously, the Right on Crime initiative there was a big
Yeah.
part of progress in this area, and your work in the White House with Brooke Rollins
Hmm.
and the First Step Act. But there's a lot of stuff to be done on that set of issues. So cost of living, broadly speaking, with an emphasis on housing, higher ed, healthcare, energy, financial services, and then K through 12 education, criminal justice reform, and broader economic reform. So tax reform, trade,
Yeah.
immigration, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. All important, of course. And when you're looking at all these, and I guess a lot of it, most of it's at the federal level. Is that right? Do you do some state things as well?
We started out when we started FREOPP, my intention was to only do federal because
Yeah.
the problem that we were trying to solve, as I alluded to earlier, was this 60 vote in the Senate problem. Like you take the repeal and replace debate on healthcare, something I was very involved in. It was a train wreck from the beginning because Republicans and conservatives and think tankers, frankly, were not thinking hard about how do you attract any Democrats
Hmm.
to your reform idea, because you cannot, through reconciliation, the process where you only use 50 votes in the Senate rather than 60, there's not a lot you can do with reconciliation in healthcare. There's a
Hmm.
lot of stuff in Obamacare that was regulatory in nature and therefore needed 60 votes to change, not merely 50.
Yeah.
And so the repeal and replace process that Republicans tried to do was messed up and flawed from the start. And so, for us, I mean, that for the healthcare work, that was a federal thing, and not just healthcare. There's a bunch of things that are federal in orientation, and also
Hmm.
because we're based in downtown Austin, several blocks down the street from TPPF, and
Yeah.
TPPF's a great state-based think tank, and we didn't want, our goal was not to be redundant. Our goal was
Yeah.
to solve this big problem of federal reform. But as we've gone along, what we found is that we got a lot of incoming calls from governors, from state legislators about state and local issues where they thought our expertise was important, and
Hmm.
where in their particular state, the local state think tank was not necessarily working on that issue, or at least didn't have the approach or the expertise or the specific angle that we had.
Hmm.
And so we found ourselves pulled into a lot of state and local things. And as we built out a FREOPP so that we're in all these issues now, we're in 12 policy areas. Some of those policy areas are more state and local in nature. So healthcare is very federal,
Hmm.
but something like K through 12 education is much more of a state and local issue.
Yeah.
Housing is kind of all the
Yeah.
above. There's a federal piece and a local piece with zoning laws and things like that. And with criminal justice reform, same thing. It's mostly state and local with some
Hmm.
federal thrown in. So what we've found as we've gone along is that every issue is a little different in terms of the balance of power between the feds and localities and states.
Yeah.
And so what we now do is we take it issue by issue and try to cover the whole stack. So
Hmm.
we cover state, local, and federal, and we basically try to think about all elements of the problem, and that helps us in the sense that a lot of times there may be a state that wants to do something on a particular issue like housing policy, but they're constrained by federal housing aid that kind of controls how states behave. And you have to be aware of those issues and think them through before you can talk about state-based reform. So
Yeah.
in some cases, it's purely local. In some cases, it's purely federal. So that's a long-winded way of saying we try to focus on the issue and where the leverage is on that particular issue.
Yeah. I think that's important, and it's needed for sure. And one thing I was thinking about as you were mentioning some of those is that cost of living that you talked about. I mean, it's been so important. It's been on people's minds more of the last couple of years than normal, as inflation, at least measured by the CPI, was running 2% or less for more than a decade, and then now it went up to 9%. It's hovering around 4%. Let's say now, still about twice what the Federal Reserve wants to be at this average rate of 2%. And I've talked with different economists on the show, Avik, with John Cochran and John Taylor and others, and glean from them some of their thoughts and everything. And of course, it comes down to government spending too much, running up debt, the Federal Reserve printing too much money, and then we create all this inflationary pressures. But you're right to highlight how a lot of these are based on state and local policies as well that are certainly not helping the situation, especially when it comes to housing, when it comes to other sort of localized issues on the cost of living, even as these more federal, national things can certainly influence a lot of these markets.
Well, it all goes together too, because
Yeah.
one thing we do, for example, in housing policy, is when we give housing aid to people at the local level, that housing aid has a cost of living adjustment.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so if you're San Francisco and you're driving up people's cost of living, the federal subsidies ratchet up to
Yeah.
account for that. So the locality in a way is actually subsidized for driving up the cost of living
Hmm.
for its residents. And that is an example of how federal aid skews the incentives for
Yeah.
localities, and that's one of the things we have to fix. And one of the reasons why I think having a holistic view of state versus local versus federal policy, particularly when it comes to social policy, is really important.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of the things I talk a lot about is institutions and the importance of institutions. And a lot of these institutions, people don't think about just the market itself. Between voluntary exchange between people is an institution that I think we need to make sure we get right and have private property rights and things of that nature. Order, as you mentioned, security is going to be important as part of that process. But too often, government does get in the way. And there has been this ongoing discussion here recently that I know you've been a part of. I've been a part of this as well, where, you've had the folks on the left for a while have talked about industrial policy, subsidizing certain areas, whether it's renewable energy or something like that for a long time. But now you have the right as well, wanting to get more involved in this space on industrial policy, manufacturing, things of that nature. And it's been interesting because now there has been, it's almost like a rift of the old progressivism, whether it's from the left or the new right or whatever they want to call it nowadays, this national conservatism sort of movement that's been going on, that you helped write these principles of the freedom conservatism. Is what some are calling the new right, or the old, no, sorry, the old right, right? The Reagan zombie
The other way
years.
around.
Yeah,
The national conservatives are the old right, and
yeah,
I
that's
mean,
right.
it
That's
all
right. But
depends on what time frame you're talking
yeah,
about.
that's right. That's why I get confused sometimes thinking about it. But I wanted to spend some time talking about this, Ovi, because I think it's really important. Given the day and age that we're in right now, we're hearing a lot of discussion about this, the populism, everything else. I mean, it helps to win votes, but the policy, I think, is heading us in the wrong direction. And maybe it doesn't lead to votes. I see you shaking your head.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so
I'm
what are
not
you
so sure
thinking?
about
What are
it.
you thinking?
Well, there was a great essay that just came out in Law and Liberty, I believe, by James Patterson.
Mm,
I think it's called "The Realignment That Wasn't." Yeah, in
mm-hmm.
Law and Liberty. Really good article that dissects some of this argument around, the so-called populist realignment. And one of the things you hear a lot of the national conservatives say is there's no market for classical liberalism. That if you
Mm,
look at like a two by two matrix of economic freedom and social values, that people are either pro social democratic economics, meaning left of center economics, and right of center culturally,
yeah.
or they're right of center culturally and they're right of center on economics, which means pro free markets, I guess. And those are the two big clusters. And and then there's some people who are like socialists who are like left of center economics, left of center on values. But there's not, like, the libertarians are a small constituency, which is true. Libertarians are a small constituency, but that's missing the point. The
Yeah.
point is that actually the coalition, the three-legged stool of free markets, traditional values, and American leadership, around the world, that coalition is still a very robust coalition. And that, in fact, if you actually dissect polling data, that coalition is still there. Yes, Trump was a populist in certain ways and elevated the populist component
Yeah.
of the constituency. But this idea that people are really tired of free markets, it's not true. And this article gets into a lot of that. And one of the things that the article points out is that a big difference between Democrats who are, say, blue collar and culturally conservative or moderate, but center left on economics, and national conservatives who think of themselves as the same, center left on economics and conservative on culture. One big difference is that the nationalists are typically white and the blue collar Democrats are more racially diverse. And that's an
Hmm.
area that where they don't really meet up in the same place, or at least not to the same degree. And so he
Hmm.
dissects a bunch of the polling data around that, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
So all that to say that the 2 by 2 matrix is an oversimplification, and
Yeah.
that if you actually break out constituencies in different ways, you find that the constituency for freedom is still considerable and is a winning formula for the right kind of candidate.
Yeah. I agree with you, and it's I think you said it right. The realignment that wasn't, and when we're thinking about freedom conservatism, I was one of the original signatories there. You
Thanks
helped
for
write
that.
a lot of that. Yeah, of course. And continue to advance those ideas because I think they really do belong. Ovik, I'm more classical liberal, tend to be more libertarian overall, and so the idea that government should be involved in some capacity. I think that the National Conservatives get a lot of the problems correct. Like they'll argue, like look at this problem, look at this problem, or maybe from a different perspective, it sounds really good on its surface, but the underlying issue for me ends up being that they want to turn to government to solve it. And it's like, well, wait a minute, what if the government is the problem to begin with? How can you solve something with more government when the government was the problem? I don't know. My mama taught me that two wrongs don't make a right. And so I'm thinking that there's a lot of truth to that. And whenever I see a lot of these solutions that are out there, whether it's labor unions, whether it's tariffs, it's always a bigger government to expand. And Ovik, one last thing here is that it seems to be that if only we had the right people in power to make these decisions, then they could get it done. But the question to me always is, okay, what happens when the other people get in power? The people you don't like very much, they can just automatically turn this whole thing around. How does that head us in the right direction? But what do you see as kind of their advocacy here that maybe I'm missing?
No, well, but first of all, I think that's all well said. I mean, Orrin Cass, who's probably well known to
Hmm.
your listeners, and Orrin and I have known each other a long time. We're friends, and we worked on the Romney campaign together. But we have a lot of different views about this stuff. And one things he likes to talk about is the cost of. He has this thing called the cost of thriving, where he says the
Hmm.
cost of thriving in America has declined because of the rise in the cost of housing and healthcare and other things. And so his answer to that is let's subsidize them more. And it's like, how do you think housing and healthcare got so expensive in the first place?
Right.
Because we subsidized them more. That's literally what happened. So, at FREOPP, we've done all that work to show that literally the biggest driver of healthcare inflation in America is the trillions we spend subsidizing healthcare, whether it's through the tax code or whether it's through Medicare and Medicaid and other government programs. And on the housing side, it's the same thing. It's the Federal Reserve goosing the housing market by keeping interest rates low, artificially low,
Yeah.
that has led to massive asset price inflation, not just for housing, but for all real estate and also for financial markets, for the stock market, for venture capital, for private equity. And that's been great if you are the kind of person who has a stock market portfolio
Hmm.
or is a venture capitalist. But if you're an ordinary person without a lot saved up and you're just living paycheck to paycheck, you have not benefited from any of that. In fact, you've been harmed by it because your rent has gone up. Your ability to buy a home it's become impossible
Yeah.
for a person making 40K to put a down payment on a home. So there's a massive amount of inequality, and as you said, people like Orrin are right about that.
Yeah.
But what they don't seem to understand is how that inequality was created. They
Yeah.
argue that the inequality was created because the libertarians have been running Washington for the last 40 years, which is
Where?
just factually absurd.
Yeah.
It's just like, what planet are you living on?
Right.
If anything, it's been the complete opposite. We've had massive government intervention from both parties.
Yeah.
And that's been the problem. And so, that's why I would argue the work that we do at FREOPP is so important because we're trying to show the way of saying, hey, you don't have to repeal Medicare
Yeah.
to create a free market healthcare system. You just have to liberalize these programs and make them more market oriented. It's kind of like for a long time, conservatives and libertarians have advocated for universal education savings accounts or school vouchers and these kinds of things. And that's, by the way, government subsidies,
Yeah.
taxpayer funds that are going to help people get the education of their choice. So that's not a libertarian utopia.
Yeah.
We're talking about is still a pretty significant government involvement in education, but what we're saying is we're devolving the way in which those funds are used to the individual, to the family, to the kid.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to do in healthcare too. It's not about eliminating the role of government. It's about devolving the sovereignty
Mm.
of where that money is spent to the individual as
Yeah.
much as.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Allow for those voluntary exchanges to happen. That makes a lot of sense. And when you go through this, and I don't necessarily want to read all of them, but I think it's important for the audience to understand if they don't get a chance to read these. And I'll make sure to put this in the show notes page. But the Freedom Conservatism, a statement of principles, is to ensure that America's best days are ahead. We must apply the timeless principles of liberty, the challenge of the 21st century. And there are 10 of these. One being number one, liberty, right? Number two, the pursuit of happiness. Three, the foundation of prosperity. Four, full faith and credit. Five, a nation of laws, not men. Number six, Americans by choice. Number seven, out of many, one. Number eight, America's promissory note. Number nine, the shining city on a hill. And number 10, freedom of conscience. All key issues that go on there. Are there some that you think embody the movement that we need to have more than others? Or are all of these things that we need to move forward? Because I think that there, probably some disagreement about, okay, what about this one? What about this one? And what about others? But what would you say kind of about those 10 statements there, 10 principles?
The first thing I would say, and anyone who wants to take a look at it, just go to freedomconservatism.org.
Yes.
That's the website where the statement of principles and other updates from us are available. And it's a Substack, so you can subscribe to it like any other Substack newsletter. I'd say a couple things. The first thing is that we modeled the statement after the Sharon statement, or we built off of it. It's not a copy and paste of the Sharon statement, but for those who are familiar with or aren't familiar with the history of American conservatism, a bunch of people, including Bill Buckley and his colleagues, got together in 1960, I believe, in Bill Buckley's house in Sharon, Connecticut, where they founded this organization called the Young Americans for Freedom, and basically put together these 10 principles. It was a bunch of college kids and kids in their 20s, young people in their 20s, who put this together to say, here's what we stand for. Here's how we're putting together this new conservative movement that's going to be this three-legged stool of individual freedom and economic freedom, conservative social values, and American leadership around the world. So we wanted to revive and resuscitate and renew that movement by building on the Sharon statement, both by kind of reiterating those core principles, and in particular, the emphasis on freedom, right? So if you compare to the National Conservatives, where they say individual freedom is great, but individual freedom really has to be second or subordinate to the national interest. The national interest has to come first. Who gets to decide what's in the national interest? Well, I suppose that'll depend on who's in power. But they're confident that they'll be the ones who get to tell everybody what's in the national interest and not anyone else. So for us, we wanted to say that freedom is the most important thing, because not that we're against the national interest. In fact, the American interest, the reason why America is the greatest country in the world is because we are free. It is because we are free that we have the most dynamic and prosperous economy. We're the richest country in the history of the world, because we've attracted people from all over the world who wanted to build a new life for themselves here and create amazing products and amazing services and amazing institutions here in the United States. So freedom is the real spine. We wanted to really emphasize that, given the environment we have now, where freedom is less fashionable than it's been in a while. Thing number one is renew the three-legged stool and the ingredients of the Sharon statement. Thing number two is to emphasize the role of freedom in particular in the coalition. And then the third piece was to modernize or renew the movement by addressing some of the particular blind spots of the 20th century American conservative movement and showing that we are addressing those blind spots or those gaps. And so there's three places in the statement where we use the phrase "we commit." One, we say we commit to addressing the rising cost of living through economic freedom. So how can we solve the problems of rising healthcare, rising housing costs, inflation, et cetera, these challenges that ordinary Americans have, those working class, blue collar Americans, but not just blue collar Americans, all Americans who have that, who are living paycheck to paycheck, whether you're blue collar, white collar, or anything else. Let's make sure we have an agenda for people in that cohort, and we're not simply saying it's all going to be fine, don't worry about it, right? So I think that's been a gap in the 20th century conservative and libertarian movement, where we just said it's not the government's job to worry about this, so we're not going to worry about it. And that's a flawed approach, because the government's already screwing up all these sectors. And so you have to show that you've got an affirmative agenda for reforming the role that government has in healthcare and housing and higher education and K through 12 and energy and all this stuff, because the government's involved already.
Yes.
So you can't just wave your hand and say the government shouldn't be involved. That's my solution. Like, that's not good enough when you have to actually advise policymakers. So we commit to having a constructive agenda on that.
Yep.
We also commit to having a constructive agenda on reducing the federal debt and getting our entitlements under control. That's absolutely essential to the survival of America. And that's something that the National Conservatives don't talk about at all in their statement, which to me is decadent. You can't talk about the national interest if you are ignoring the thing that is really going to, the biggest threat to our national security, the biggest threat to our prosperity is the debt.
Totally
so
agree.
To solve that.
Totally agree. And
then the third one is we commit to addressing the downstream effects of slavery and Jim Crow. So this is something that was controversial. There are people who say, well, what do you mean? Does that mean you're for racial set-asides or racial quotas or affirmative action? And we say very explicitly in the statement, no, we are against racial discrimination of all kinds for or against any individual or group on the basis of race. But what we are also acknowledging is that there are policies that were put in place during the pre-civil rights era that have an effect on people today.
Yeah.
For example, if you were, when the New Deal was put in, and a lot of these policies were put in that helped people own their first home or go to college for the first time, those primarily benefited white people because Black people were not able to accumulate the sort of wealth that allowed them to have a down payment or to buy homes in areas that were off limits to colored people, things like that. And so that's not to say that we should have, again, racial set-asides today, but we should acknowledge the fact that people who live in what used to be legally segregated neighborhoods, they're not legally segregated now, they're more de facto segregated, and have poor schools as a result because we're requiring that people only go to the schools that are in their local area. It has a downstream effect on people. So that's why we support school choice. That's why we support universal education savings accounts. That's why we support reducing the cost of living, because non-white Americans are disproportionately low income relative to whites and Asians. And so, if you actually make America more affordable for everybody, you happen to address some of these inequities from the past. So it's not like we're not saying, let's be race conscious or anything like that, or be woke or whatever. We're saying, let's address the economic challenges that all Americans have. And if we do that, that will actually help remedy some of the cost of segregation from the past.
Yeah, that's right. And I agree with you to 100% about the national debt. I say this often. I think is our biggest national crisis that's going on, because it touches our foreign policy. Where are we going to pay for this debt? How does this influence us on dealing with what happened in Ukraine or in Israel and all these other things that are going on? It influences our local domestic policy as it crowds out $1 trillion now is what we're paying just on that interest on the debt, much less the other things that it's going to crowd out in the economy. And we see the effects now of inflation and higher interest rates are soaring. I mean, all of these things go back to the excessive spending that's been going on. And look, Avik, I'm not one who says that tax cuts pay for themselves. I think over time you get incentive effects and you do get some rising tax revenue, but we've got to focus on spending. If your spending is growing at a faster rate than taxes are coming in, you're going to run up deficits. And
this is one of the mistakes of one of the mistakes of the Reagan era was you had this group of supply side economists who said they called it starve the beast. And their theory was, if you cut taxes and we don't get the spending cuts that we want, it's okay, because over time the deficits will be so large that people will have no choice but to reduce the spending. And we have 4 years of evidence that that's not how it works in Washington. And so, that turned out to be, I mean, those tax cuts were important for economic growth, defeating the Soviet Union. And so you can still argue they're good policy, but it was a mistake to believe that the deficit was magically going to come down, because the problem we have is mandatory spending. The discretionary spending on things like that are subject to the normal budgeting process of Congress, where we say, here's what we want to spend on defense this year. Here's what we want to spend on highways this year. Here's what we want to spend on food stamps this year.
Right.
That process works okay. The problem is that the big entitlement programs like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security are not subject to that appropriations process, as you know. And they basically, what happens with Medicare is seniors rack up their bills every year with the Medicare program, and the government pays them. And at the end of the year, we just get a report. Okay, here's how much Medicare spent this year. Congress has no ability to directly say, we want to spend X $100 billion or X trillion dollars on Medicare this year, and have that be a hard cap on spending or Medicare spending. It just doesn't work that way. And that is a huge, huge problem that we've got to fix. And, that's one of the things we work hard on every day at FREOPP.
That's right. That's right. Well, guys, we're wrapping up here. It's been a great discussion. Thank you so much. And I think we've got a lot that we could keep talking about all day. What are the next steps? What should we and the audience and others be thinking about, like what we should do next? I mean, of course, go to the website, freedomconservatism.org, sign up there, check out freeop.org as well, and do those sort of things. But what do you kind of see as the next steps that we need to be doing to make sure that we start to get we're moving this ship in the wrong direction? How do we get it turned in the right direction?
The thing I would ask all of your viewers and listeners to do is to think about, what's your best idea for leveraging your principles and your values to help Americans on the bottom half of the ladder? What's your favorite idea to do that? What do you think could make the biggest difference for lower and middle income Americans? Because if we all start thinking that way, I think too often our movement has been about, leave me alone and let me keep my stuff. And believe me, I prefer to be left alone, and I prefer keeping my stuff above probably other alternatives. But that's a movement that's inward looking. That's a movement that doesn't convince others to join with us. So I think if we all just have the mentality, like Arthur Brooks used to talk about, if we all have the mentality of what is your favorite idea for improving the lives of other people, particularly those who are lower on the ladder than you are. And you invest in advocating for that idea and supporting the institutions that are advancing that idea, we can all make a huge difference on all the issues we care about.
Amen. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Avik. Continue the great work you're doing, and God bless you and your family and all the work along with FREOPP and everything else.
You too, Vance. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Awesome. This sounds great. Well, thank you to Avik, and for the audience, please go and give us a 5-star rating and subscribe and share this with all your friends and family in the process, and leave us a review. That always helps as well. And until next time, let people prosper.